I hear myself but with an echo. So that's going to force me to talk slow. I didn't want to rush through this. Okay, well, a little bit about who I am. I've got my notes over here because I can't remember everything. I've been working on this topic for about 9 years, so I've got notes over there. I'm a philosopher, but I'm not a philosopher of law. Definitely not, no background as a lawyer or a law professor, let alone a judge. I'm an outsider. I'm a philosopher going into an area that's not my own. Okay, so what kind of philosopher? Well, what is ex-philosopher? I'm interested in ontology, what there is and what there isn't, and the nature of what there is. I'm also interested in explanation. So when we get now, am I still a philosopher if I want to engage in explanation? Many would say no. I really don't care. Call it whatever you want. Okay. Anyway, what is X? So human rights are a big concept in our world. So what are human rights? That's what I'm interested in, and want to understand them. And are they real? What are people talking about? Right? That sort of thing. Okay. Now, there's no question we live in the age of human rights. It's been said over and over and over again. We have the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, preambles, bills, charters, human rights museums, human rights lawyers, human rights commissions, councils, tribunals, the ACLU, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The age of human rights. So what are human rights is a big question for us today. Wouldn't be 1,000 years ago. Arguably, it wouldn't even be 500 years ago. Anyway, human rights, we have to start with meaning. Now, one thing I noticed over and over again in reading the literature is that there's a sort of bedrock definition. Human rights, the rights that all humans have by virtue of being human, right? That's the simplest bedrock definition. I'll give you a few prominent individual expressions. Maurice Cranston, a philosopher, human rights are a form of moral right. Agreement, I mean, it's pretty easy. They differ from other moral rights in being the rights of all people and in all situations. And he refers to equality among men. Pretty standard stuff. Jack Donnelly, International Studies, wrote a book, or at least one, a number of editions on human rights. He says one is either or is not a human being, and therefore has the same rights as everyone else, or not at all. So if you're a human being, you've got all the human rights. If you're not a human being, you have none of them. Pretty standard stuff. Lynn Hunt, professor of modern European history. For rights to be human rights, all rights everywhere in the world. All humans everywhere in the world. Imagine me without notes. All humans everywhere in the world must possess them equally and only because of their status as human beings. I could get plenty more of quotations that are similar. Right away, we get a distinction between human rights and conventional man-made rights. Now, I'm going to say something rather naive. It seems to me that man-made rights are at bottom non-controversial. They would be controversial for lawyers and judges and legal scholars, of course, but ontologically, they're pretty simple and straightforward. They are real. I'm not going to argue that man-made rights are not real. They're as real as the agreements on which they are based. No problem. So, for example, if I'm the CEO of a company, I've got the right to the parking spot for the CEO. I can lose that right. I'm no longer the CEO. Rights are given and taken away. voting rights, driving a car. If I lend my bicycle to you, you have a right to use it based on the agreement, right? No question about this. Problematic in legal context, but ontologically, there's just pretty straightforward. The concept of human rights, however, is very different. First of all, there's no one human rights concept. I talked about a bedrock before, but that doesn't change that. There is what I call the consensus concept, and then there are many of what I call non-consensus concepts. So the consensus concept, even the phrase came to me from genetics. You have the consensus sequence in genetics. So you have different genes, right? They'll pull out the consensus sequence of the 4-letter code, right? There's such a thing as a consensus sequence. Geneticists talk about that. I know about that. Okay, is there a consensus human rights concept? Well, in one meaning of consensus, like genetics, it's something there to be discovered, right? It's a matter of discovery. And if one looks at the core human rights documents, one can pull out a consensus. I'm going to get into the details of that shortly. There's also a consensus in the sense of agreement. The consensus, what I call the consensus concept of human rights, is the concept of the vast majority of believers in human rights. I'm not talking about scholars now. I'm not talking about scholarly elites in various fields. I'm talking about the world, the human population. When people talk about human rights, they have a certain basic concept. And when you read scholars on what are human rights, you find a dissonance. There's quite often a very big difference. And yet they're still talking the human rights language. So there's a problem there. There's a consensus in two sentences. I'm hearing my voice echo, and it's very weird. Anyway. So what is this consensus concept? Well, I think if one examines the central documents, one will find 5 features. One is human rights are plural. I mean, you see it in the phrase, human rights, plural. Ones like freedom of religion, healthcare, etc. What this raises is a problem called the problem of scope. How many human rights are there? Right? The problem of scope. If there's more than one, how many? If there's only one, what is it? Well, there isn't just one in the consensus concept. There's many. And the situation, the problem, is analogous to, for example, Plato and his theory of forms, his abstract essences, universal essences outside of space and time. He has clear examples he gives: triangle, beauty, justice. But later on in life, he started to become critical. Is there a form for mud, for hair, for dirt? Right? But the problem of scope faces realists such as Plato when it comes to his essences. It also is a problem for those who believe in human rights. What's the list? How many are there? Right? You get Kant, for example, saying there's only one original right belonging to every man by virtue of his humanity. I'm speaking slow again because I'm listening to my voice in echo. Probably a good thing because I tend to talk too fast sometimes. So I'm going slow. So this is going to be an extended talk. No problem. I've got the time. But Kant, what is the one human right? Call it freedom. Well, is Kant a human rights theorist? Yes, but it's not the consensus concept. Okay. Another feature or part of the consensus concept is that human rights are universal. All humans, not most, not some, all. This raises a problem, And I'm not going to use politically correct language. I'm going to use the language that I find in human rights literature, and it doesn't bother me. Maybe it should. I'm an older generation. Anyway, it's called the problem of marginal cases. There are people who don't seem to match up to the criteria. We'll see this as we go along, but clearly part of the consensus concept of human rights is that all humans have them. So if anybody argues that this is what human rights are, most humans have them, that's what I call a non-consensus concept of human rights. We're going to see an example as I go through some. Okay, so universal. Another feature of the concept, or part of the concept, is that human rights are equal. Equal. Not more equal for some people, less equal for others, but equal right across the board. Right? Equal. This is going to create a problem. What I think is a devastating problem for the consensus concept, especially given evolutionary time, which some people might think is irrelevant. I think it's highly relevant. Okay, another feature of the consensus concept of human rights is that they're innate. We come into the world with them, right? Now there's a problem. Are we talking conception? Are we talking birth? I'm going to come back to that one, but they're innate. We're born with them. Whatever specifically that means, there's some debate. Another one is that they're inalienable, right? They cannot be given or taken away. These are the 5 features. They're pretty standardly there if one looks at key human rights documents. Human rights scholars is another matter, which I'll get into. Anyway, absolute is sometimes given as a feature of the modern concept of human rights. I don't think it's one of them. I'm not going to take it as one of them. A number of scholars, human rights scholars, have pointed out that obviously rights can conflict with other rights, and that includes human rights. And they can also conflict with other considerations, moral norms and theories and so forth. So absolute, I don't put in. So when I'm doing history of human rights, I look for those 5 features, not absolute. I think that would make the concept too narrow. It wouldn't be a consensus concept. Okay, let's focus on equal human rights as part of the consensus concept of human rights. Now, there's lots of historical documents. Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal with inherent and inalienable rights, right? American Declaration of Independence, he wrote it. There was a committee of 5, it got voted. They edited it, but stuff against the king they cut out. But anyway, they also cut out anti-slavery. But anyway, so committee work, typical committee stuff, I would say. You have the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 1789. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It's pretty standard stuff. Thomas Paine, Rights of Man. It's going to be important when we come back to this quotation later. Every generation is equal in rights to the generations which preceded it. And by the same rule that every individual is born equal in rights with his contemporary. That quotation from Thomas Paine is key. He's not just talking about people at the same time, but generation after generation. Not just synchronic, but diachronic. You might know where I'm going to go with that one. All right. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. The equal, I'm quoting, the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That's Article 1. On and on and on. Explicitly implicit in every convention, charter, and draft on human rights proclaims since then. You'll find equal in the other 4 features of the consensus concept. Now, I like to do history, and history obviously gets very complicated, and contextualists make it very even more complicated. I'm not going to do that. I'm just tracing the history of ideas. This concept can be traced back in time from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to Thomas Jefferson, back to John Locke, back to the English levelers. And that I'm going to spend some time on. The English levelers are fascinating. I never heard of them before I started doing research into this topic. They were a large group that were part of the English Civil Wars, 1645 to 1649. There was maybe up to 10,000 at the time. Many were in the new model army raised by Parliament against King Charles I. Okay, they wrote, one of them, together anyway, wrote an agreement of the people, what one scholar, not just one though, but one prominent scholar has called the first proposed written constitution in history based on inalienable natural rights. This is, to me, very interesting. And it comes up big time when I try to explain the phenomenon of human rights. Okay, the biggest name here is Richard Overton. And if you want, get a chance to read his pamphlet, 1646. I'm going to read, it's maybe the first quarter of the title. An arrow against all tyrants and tyranny, shot from the prison at Newgate into the prerogative bowels of the arbitrary House of Lords and all other usurpers and tyrants whatsoever. I like that. You can find, I'm not going to go through it in my notes because of time. You can find all 5 features of the consensus concept of human rights in the writings of Overton. Collectively, this is the beginning. I'm going to argue in it. Okay. Oh, here's my big cat. Oh my goodness. This guy is a monster. There's no space for you here. Sorry. Oh, there we go. We had a catastrophe. Just a little. Sorry. Now, this is exciting. Sorry. My wire got cut. Okay, we're still rolling. Comic interlude there. All right. Anyway, I see this as a case similar to epidemiology, where you can actually trace a virus, its mutations, etc., back to a common source. It's possible that a virus can mutate in 2 different populations. Same virus can mutate into a different strain with a new name, even in 2 different populations, 2 or more. You can also have this happen in the area of ideas. Possibly this modern concept of human rights popped up in history in different places, different times, right? I don't think it did. If you focus on the consensus, this cat's driving me crazy. I love this guy though. If you focus on the consensus concept of human rights, you're not going to find it popping up here and there. I'm going to get into what I call getting the history of human rights wrong and why. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. The details are in my book, but the recurring problem is, well, I'll get to that when I get to my notes. Okay. Okay. Now, arguing that it began with the English levelers during, sorry, okay, boy, you got to go. A little slight bit of animal abuse there. Anyway, look, where was it? Yes, if it's one grants that it started with the English levelers during the English Civil Wars, it clearly spread to John Locke. He was connected with them. He was part of a revolutionary movement later on against the king at his time. And some of the members of his movement were former English levelers. He was influenced by them. He read them. He was part of a movement, a revolutionary movement. He wrote his 2 treatises of government to justify the revolution against the king. I won't get into more details, but fascinating history. This is a philosopher. This is not an armchair philosopher. This is a philosopher who was involved in a political revolution. Okay. From the American Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, you go to the French Revolution. Some have argued that Jefferson actually had an actual hand there. Maybe, maybe not, but the connection is pretty clear. The 1800s, you see a backlash, numerous biological theories of human inequality. The 1800s also experienced the rise of utilitarianism and communism, each of which is not a friendly host for human rights doctrine. Anyway, the next big date is not American Civil War. It's not World War I. World War I, most casualties were soldiers. It's World War II, where the vast majority of casualties were citizens, non-combatants. And of course, the Holocaust, huge, right? So you have the United Nations, you have the big date is 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. From there, you get this branching of numerous constitutions, charters, drafts, covenants, along with a staggering number of books, chapters, articles, and websites. Sorry. Okay, one thing. Now, how do you explain that? As a philosopher of biology, I'd like to, and I did in my book, turn to, I go way out on a limb, and I'm not afraid to do that, fall. Anyway, memetics. This is developed by a biologist, Richard Dawkins. It's the idea, we think of people having ideas. Well, how about ideas having people? And they spread from person to person, depending on the features of the ideas and the features of the brains and the cultures of people. It's a different way of looking at ideas. People as hosts for ideas. Okay. Well, when I look at the English levelers, I see a coevolution occurring, a symbiosis occurring between the concept of human rights, as Overton and others had it, and the rise of genuine democratic beliefs and values. I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't look at ancient Athens. Don't forget my name. I'm not ethnocentric. I don't look at ancient Athens as democracy. No, they're a proto-democracy. 10% of the people were citizens who could vote. No, I look at the levelers had modern democratic beliefs and values. They were fighting, of course, a big battle within their own ranks against Cromwell, etc. Anyway, why co-dependence, co-evolution, symbiosis? Well, for one thing, human rights belief works as a check and balance against the tyranny of a bad king. So you get the levelers, the tyranny is King Charles I. In the American Revolution, the tyranny was King George III. The fathers of the American Revolution, Jefferson included, actually, they learned Locke in college when they were students. They also made an effort to dig up pamphlets by the levelers. They were looking for justification for the American Revolution, and they found it. And it's not a coincidence that Jefferson put in that paragraph of human rights in the Declaration of Independence. The human rights doctrine or belief system, call it whatever you want, ideology, it also supports democracy in the sense that the greatest threat to democracy is from inside. It's what, and I look up how to pronounce his name properly, Alexis de Tocqueville, and J.S. Mill after him, we might have plagiarized, but they both said the same thing, the tyranny of the majority. You could call this the Achilles heel of democracy, the tyranny of the majority. What does human rights do? It protects individuals against the tyranny of the majority. Very interesting. Democracy and human rights reinforce each other. These two ideologies, these two systems. And I'm talking about the consensus concept of human rights. And that helps to explain the spread of human rights beliefs and doctrines, plural used there. It also helps to explain the resistance of the spread of the human rights meme, if you want to use Dawkins' term. For example, communism. If you look at the response of Marx and the Communist Party following him, Russian Communist, Soviets, right? Resistance to human rights, to some of those features of the five. Rights are state-made for Marxists. Anyway, so you get resistance there, and they play a game, international politics, etc., but lip service, but the consensus concept doesn't spread well there. Okay. Oh, what about getting the history of human rights wrong? Keeping the focus on the 5 features of the consensus concept, one can then go back in time and to see if this person or that religion or that document had the modern concept. Why would one do that? My impression is that we live in the age of human rights. Human rights are such a big thing. A lot of people, they want to believe, if they're Christian, the New Testament has it, or a new Bible scholar, the Bible has it. Muslim, the Quran, the Magna Carta of human rights, the very first. Confucius, right? And on it goes. You get the first human rights thinker, the first human rights document. You have the phrase human rights visionaries, human rights pioneers. That's fine, but don't confuse that with the consensus concept of human rights. And I have ancestors, as you do, right? An ancestor of me is not me, right? A precursor of a concept is not the same concept. What I found when looking at the history of human rights, Plato, Aristotle, the Old Testament, the New Testament, Cicero is a human rights thinker, Ulpian, more interesting than Cicero, Confucius, Cyrus the Great, the Quran, one scholar called it the Magna Carta of human rights. Wrong on both counts. The Magna Carta was not a human rights document. And the Quran, the 5 features are not there. Pretty straightforward. The Middle Ages, Huguccio. At least one medievalist puts his money on Huguccio. William of Ockham, Jean Gerson. I discuss all of these in my book in detail. If you ask me for details about it right now, I'd have to look up some of it. Then we get Grotius, Hobbes. Hobbes, I found, is the favorite of all of these lists of what I call getting the history of human rights wrong. Hobbes is, I think, more literature on him being the father of modern human rights than anybody else. I could be wrong. So my Pufendorf is another one, and my answer to all of these is no, no, no. What one finds a lot in the history of human rights is what sometimes is called presentism. Reading the present or present ideas into the past and doing it illegitimately. Presentism, it's a sin of history. There's also confirmation bias going on, ethnocentrism going on widely, biases in terms of academics. I'm a scholar of Roman literature. I find the ancient Romans had the modern concept of human rights, Cicero, etc. It's huge, but wrong. They take their eyes off the ball. Those 5, let me see my fingers, 5 features. Let's make sure I got 5 fingers. All right. Now, without getting into details, okay, now that's history. What about what I call non-consensus of human rights? This is where you get the scholarship, modern scholarship on human rights, defending human rights, elucidating human rights. here's where you find typically non-consensus concepts. These can be divided into three groups. Maybe it's arbitrary, but anyway. One is human rights flow from a particular moral theory. Peter Singer is a good example of this. He's a utilitarian, the famous. He's my favorite. My favorite ethicist to read is Peter Singer, utilitarian. What does he say about human rights? He says they're a shorthand, a verbal shorthand for what we ought to do from a utilitarian point of view. He's not a human rights believer, right? Mill, same thing. Utility is the foundation of utilitarianism, not rights. Rights talk is just clothing. Bentham, a clear rejection, called human rights rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. Well, these are, Mill and Singer anyway, non-consensus concepts of human rights based on a particular moral theory, utilitarianism. Most people who believe in human rights do not come from the land of moral theory. Definitely a non-consensus concept. Human rights is a social construction as man-made. This seems to be favored. Again, I haven't read everything. I haven't taken a poll. I haven't read surveys on this. My impression, this is favored by political scientists and legal scholars. But once again, most people who believe in human rights don't come from the land of social constructionist theory. They're realists. Some human rights are something we actually have. Many believe they came from God. Malcolm X, JFK. I mean, you find many examples from our time, our lifetime, right? Some think they're just part of human nature, but they're not clear about it. Once again, intellectual elites, sorry, do not represent most human rights believers. The consensus concept is not focusing on scholars, right? Okay. Human rights is flowing, the third one, again, this distinction is arbitrary. Human rights is flowing from or being part of human nature. That does seem to be in line with the consensus concept of human rights, but it's not necessarily the case. I will give you two examples of human rights theorists who base human rights on human nature, but what they give is a non-consensus concept. So it gets very interesting. Anyway, what I am not being particularly nice, but I look at these non-consensus concepts as parasites. They're parasitic on an animal, you might say, the consensus concept of human rights. The consensus concept came first. The non-consensus concepts feed on it and get their life from it. Without the consensus concepts, you wouldn't have these non-consensus concepts existing, I hazard to say. Anyway, being parasitic, they tend to use the same language as the consensus concept of human rights. And they're sometimes even given as defenses of the consensus concept of human rights, but they're not. One has to keep one eye on the ball of those 5 features. They're not the same. So some examples. Jack Donnelly wrote a book, a number of editions on human rights. His background is the international studies, maybe political science, but he says, right, I like it when he's honest, straightforward. Human nature is a social construction. There's no such thing as human nature out there waiting to be discovered. We make it. It's social construction. He then focuses on a remarkable international normative consensus on the list of rights. That's human rights. Human rights are needed for a life of dignity worthy of a human being. Human rights are what people might become. They're a matter of an underlying moral vision. They rest on, quote, a social decision to act as though such things existed. That's a social constructionist theory of human rights. It's not the consensus concept. More recently, we have the political scientist Charles Beitz, looked up how to pronounce his name on YouTube. He rejects naturalistic approaches. He says they don't capture the human rights concept found in the UDHR. I'll just keep saying that. He rejects also theistic theories. So what's the foundation of human rights? For him, the functions of human rights in international practice as basic. That's what he takes, international practice. He refers to international doctrine. He calls it international human rights. His concept is not a consensus concept. It has the form and or function of the consensus concept of human rights, but it lacks the substance. It lacks the ontological commitment of the consensus concept of human rights. And how do I defend that? Quite quickly, he says human rights is a modern concept, basically began with the United Nations. It's not the concept of Jefferson, not the concept of Locke. They had the ontological commitment, right? He claims the United Nations does not. The United Nations version of human rights, he says, is that of, quote, an emergent political practice. That's the foundation, social constructionism. He calls it international human rights. To model level, you have human rights law in an individual state, and then you have international law, international concern. The second level, the international, determines the scope of the first level. Nice try at solving the problem of scope. The right to be fat, claimed as a human right, is not of international concern. So it doesn't come within the scope of his concept, his international human rights concept. All right. One problem is he uses the language of have. We have human rights. That can be confused with the consensus concept. Right? I have a cold. I have 10 fingers. Right? We also use the word have in a social constructionist mode. And I have a right because of this agreement. Okay, fine. All right. But when he says we have human rights, he does not mean have that you find in the consensus concept. Different meaning of have. More importantly, he's wrong about the United Nations. A number of scholars have pointed out, not against him in particular, but against that kind of criticism. He rejects that international human rights law has human rights as an ontological property. He rejects that. The language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, though, as a number of scholars have argued, not replying to bites, but just on this topic, have argued that the language is moral realism, moral ontological property realism. Human rights are ontological properties of a sort, moral properties of all human beings and equally. Okay, well, you find the word equal there, you find the word born there. I'm going to come back to that one. I remember one scholar in particular focused on the word recognition. In UDHR, human rights are already there. They need to be recognized. They exist even if they're not recognized, right? And they need to be respected by every individual and organ of society. There's an ontological commitment there. What about the word born? Well, yeah, there were delegates and they voted on kind of like history of Christianity is reincarnation going to be part of official Christian doctrine, right? They voted on it, the bishops, right? The 1/3, in fact, who argued for reincarnation lost. Okay, what about born? Well, you had some delegates arguing, typically from South America, by the way, not only that born means the moment of conception, right? You can probably guess why. But the majority voted for the moment of birth. Okay. Now, anyway, there are lots of social constructionist theories of human rights. Another one is Alan Dershowitz, one of my favorite legal scholars. I love reading him and watching him on TV. Wrote a book, Rights from Wrongs, 2004. His approach is bottom up. Bottom up from what? Well, not top down. Human rights don't come from God. Not bottom up. They don't come from nature, and they don't come from law. Where do they come from? Collective, our collective human experience of typical wrongs is the foundation of the development of human rights, beliefs, doctrines, and laws. Okay, but that's a social constructionist approach, right? James Griffin, philosopher. Now, his approach, 2008 book, he has a realist human nature approach, not social constructionist, and yet his is a non-consensus concept of human rights. He says our modern concept of human rights is secular. It's lost its theological basis. I'll agree with that. I'm not going to argue with that. Uh, uh, but it's left largely indeterminate. What does that mean? Well, even if the extension, what the term refers to, like rat, extension, denotation, even if the scope has been settled, right? And I don't think it has. The intention, the meaning of the term is not settled, not determinate in his language. So his proposal, it's a proposal. I love people who take risks making theories. Make a theory, you have to expect some criticism. His proposal is that we see human rights as protections of what he calls our normative agency. Now, by normative agency, he doesn't just mean agency, rational, an agent, a rational agent. He means active autonomy involved with a conception of a worthwhile life, not necessarily a plan. Okay. He calls this the ground of human rights. Now, why is this a non-consensus? Why is this a problematic concept given the consensus concept? Well, first problem, needed protections are not automatically actual possessions. I might need a bodyguard. Doesn't mean I have a bodyguard, right? Second, his proposal leaves out a lot of humans, the underdeveloped, young children. They don't meet yet his definition of normative agency. And the permanently, again, no PC here. This word is used in his book and many others. The permanently defective. I know it's not PC, but anyway. His reply is to appeal to a borderline or threshold which captures, quote, the vast majority of adult mankind. Right away, we do not have the consensus concept of human rights. He's not defending it. He's altered it and defending that. He doesn't have the universal feature in the consensus concept of human rights. Moral claims and entitlements that all humans are born with, rights they have by virtue of being human. This is a non-consensus concept. So what he's offered, really, his proposal, is a reconceptualization of human rights, not a defense or clarification of human rights. He's reconceptualized the intention and the extension of the term human rights, non-consensus theorists. All right, Martha Nussbaum, I love interdisciplinary, professor of law, philosophy, divinity, classics. Wow, I really seriously admire that. Her approach is to equate human rights with what she calls central human capabilities. Why? Because they make for, quote, a life fully human, right? She gives a provisional list of 10 groupings. Okay. What matters, and she calls herself an Aristotelian, a neo-Aristotelian. She's an Aristotle scholar, which is very interesting. Aristotle, natural slaves, natural masters, the sexism, the racism. Why Aristotle? Because he believed in such a thing called human nature, full human nature, the theory of human nature, but he focused on function, right? The full human being has the full functioning of a human being. right? Uh, the fullness of a human being. Okay, well, her approach is not to focus on function, but to focus on capability and choice. That's where she finds the equation, or at least the ground for human rights. She says, for example, we can have a life fully human even if we choose to abstain from sex, right? So, what does that mean for human rights? Forced virginity violates that capability. Female circumcision violates that capability for sexual enjoyment. Uh, that's where the human rights would come in, violating uh, central human capabilities. All right. So she does not, unlike natural law theory, which is what a cloudy concept, natural law. Won't get into it. But it's meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Uh, Slavery justified by not, sorry. She does not believe in pushing individuals into the function, right? It's capabilities. Now, many rights, she says, are matter of a combined capability. There's an internal capability of the individual, and that has to be combined with necessary external conditions provided by society, so-called second generation of human rights. Anyway, why does she, if we're talking about central human capabilities, why even talk about human rights? Why even bring in human rights talk? Her answer is because of moral resonance. Well, that's a parasitic acknowledgement there. Okay, central human capabilities and human rights are not the same concept. Uh, I might be capable of having a long life. Doesn't logically follow I have a right to a long life. I might have a right to a long life, whatever that means. Doesn't logically follow that I'm capable of having a long life. I might have a serious genetic disease. Right? They're not the same concepts. Given any capability at bottom, it's an open question whether I have a moral right to exercise it. Moreover, every biological species, let's bring in biology. Aristotle was a biologist, father of biology, sometimes it's called. Every biological species has its central capabilities. Doesn't mean there are moral capabilities, right? In fact, Nussbaum wants to extend her moral human rights approach to all sentient species. That would include elephants, cats, dogs, mice. Well, that's not consistent with the consensus concept of human rights. I mean, the word human is right in there, right? Also, she's not consistent in refraining from a ban on meat, which is an internal inconsistency. Moreover, what is part of the function? We're going to just go function and purpose of human rights doctrine. It's to reduce conflict within the human species, within human societies, and internationally, right? And I take that to be, generally speaking, a good thing. It doesn't automatically follow that it's a good thing for the animal world, the world of sentient animals, to reduce conflict within and between species. No. Heraclitus comes to mind. Here, war is father and king of all. Look at ecosystems, food chains, food webs. Right. Anyway, a further problem with human capabilities, central or otherwise, they don't give us universal, equal human rights, right? So, and she knows this. So she takes the quote species norm as the threshold. She does not include. She does not exclude mental, physical defectives. She does not include them because of any degree of similarity to the species norm. She includes them simply because they are members of the human species, and that is pretty clearly speciesism, akin to racism and sexism. Peter Singer did not coin the term. What was his name? Psychologist coined the term. This book over there, apparently. Okay. Not a consensus concept, but a nice try. That was my favorite. Okay. Second topic, human rights and truth. Well, appeals to theology aren't going to fly in the academic community. There are some scholars who argue, Nicholas Wolsterstorff, for example, but typically we're in a secular age, right? Same for the appeal to human rights as self-evident truths. I've seen many scholars today within my lifetime and their publications use the appeal to self-evident. Human rights is self-evident. A colleague of mine wrote an introduction to critical reasoning, put that in his introduction, that they're self-evidently true. I had to correct him on that. Well, as one philosopher put it, claiming self-evidence is basically saying you don't have an argument. There's another problem, though. The human history, has a large graveyard for so-called self-evident truths. Just look at science alone. Darwin and evolution. Darwin rejected what was called the axiom of species fixity. Einstein, with relativity theory, rejected Euclid's axiom of parallel lines. Quantum physics requires the rejection of quantum states as inherently deterministic. It defies our logic, right? Self-evident doesn't mean true, right? It's a bad argument to say, well, they're self-evidently true, right? Now, going back to biology, biology is quite relevant to the topic of human rights. I have a hard time getting people to see that. Evolutionary biology, especially. If one studies evolutionary biology, and I have always a problem with students on this topic, so I made a document to just send them to, biologists call evolution a fact, not a theory. Forget the phrase evolutionary theory like Big Bang theory. The phrase, right, doesn't capture the thought. Evolutionary biologists repeatedly refer to evolution as a fact, beyond a phrase that many will recognize, beyond a reasonable doubt. Got a whole bunch of names here. I'm not going to go through them. Dobzhansky, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Fukushima, National Geographic, Kenneth Miller, Catholic cell biologist, Jerry Coyne, Why Evolution is True, Richard Dawkins, The Greatest Show on Earth, and on and on and on. Pick up any biology journal, a quarterly review of biology. Evolution is the framework, taken as a fact. Debates are not about whether evolution is true. Okay, well, what relevance is this? Biologists think in terms of two dimensions. One is a synchronic, at the same time. How many species of birds are there in North America? Synchronic, right? They also think diachronically, over time, going back through time, large scales of time, synchronic and diachronic. You get this in linguistics, this distinction. You get this in the literature on the species problem. Arguably, that's the one I cut my teeth on, my first book, right? Or the paper on this. It's pretty pervasive. Right? Well, what does this have to do with human rights? Recall Thomas Paine, Rights of Man, 1791. Getting close to the end, by the way. I'll quote it again. Every generation is equal in rights to the generation which preceded it, by the same rule that every individual is born equal in rights with his contemporary. Beautiful, beautiful. This captures, it's not just Paine, this captures what is strongly implicit, if not implicit, in the consensus concept of human rights. They're not just equal and universal synchronically. They're equal and universal back through time. My generation, the generation before, all the way down, right? Okay, bring in evolutionary biology. The consensus concept of human rights makes absolutely no sense from the viewpoint of evolutionary biology. As we proceed back through evolutionary time, and the key word is gradualism, I know about the theory of punctuated equilibria. Even it is a controversial theory, and the punctuation is 5,000 to 50,000 years if you accept that theory, right? We're not getting a jump in one generation, right? It's not going to happen, right? Especially with humans. So it's an incremental diachronic going back in time. Bush-like, Darwin uses the tree, the tree metaphor. Biologists refer to a bush. It's very detailed, right? Well, the bottom line is you can't, ontologically, you cannot have all humans having human rights not only synchronically and equally, but diachronically through past generations of human beings. It doesn't fit. It's like making a map and saying it's permanent. Meanwhile, you got plate tectonics, right? Right. Okay. So bottom line is, if evolution is true, human rights are false. That's devastating to the consensus concept. What about non-consensus concepts? Well, that lack that ontological commitment. Well, there's a problem with them too. Some of them might face this problem. I call it the diachronic thrust, given their specific non-consensus human rights concept. But even if it doesn't, there's another problem. I call it the hypocrisy thrust. It's I think the height of hypocrisy to have a doctrine which is proclaimed to fight prejudice, inequality, and hierarchical oppression, when that doctrine itself is filled with prejudice, inequality, and hierarchical oppression. I'm talking about the anthropocentrism and the speciesism of human rights. All right. Now, what about the final section, the shortest section, human rights and law? What does this have to do with law? Law professors, judges, legal scholars, is any of this relevant? I think it is. Again, I have no background in law. I'm not even a philosopher of law. What am I? I don't know. Right? Just a thinker, maybe. Not even that. All right. I like to beat myself up. All right, keeps me honest. All right, what is relevant? Well, obviously in human rights legal cases, one has to know the law, national and international if it's relevant. And one also has to know precedent cases, of course, right? Even I know that. Obviously for human rights legal cases, I can't imagine a lawyer arguing whether human rights are true or objectively real, or divinely bestowed, or social constructions. I don't imagine that coming up. I could be wrong, right? But knowing about the
Professor Stamos,
features, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, I'll go very quickly. Knowing the 5 features of the consensus concept, one could be able to argue whether a particular human rights claim is frivolous, right? For example, abortion is a human right. Okay, people argue the state should legalize abortion, but should provide abortion services, right? But it fails to meet the universal criterion of human rights. Why? Women's rights cannot be human rights. To me, it's just plain obvious. Why? Not all humans are women, right? Roughly half. The universal criterion of the consensus concept is violated. One could reply with social constructionism. Male, female is a social construction. Human rights are a social construction. But then one should admit that one strayed very far from the consensus concept of human rights. Same with other group rights, Aboriginal rights, Christian rights. These are mutated concepts of human rights. They are noticeably different from the consensus concept. A group of humans is not a human being. Admitting group rights is a kind of reductio ad absurdum. Clears the way for any group to claim its natural rights to this or that. You get the tyranny of majority groups. You also can get the tyranny of the majority. Either way, and I'm done with timing, it spells the end of the symbiosis between human rights and democratic beliefs and values. That's my radical talk on human rights. Pretty good timing.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful demonstration. And I will now open the floor to your questions. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand. Professor Pavlovich, do you want to?
I can ask in vivo, or you can read my question.
Yeah.
You may
I can hear
choose.
you.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Thank you very much for your provocative lecture and presentation. Well, I guess that I am a majority who doesn't agree with your standing. my my impression is that you're just simply naming myth something that is necessary starting step for the human rights project to rely on self-evident truth that some rights are inalienable and inherent to all the human beings. Somebody had to start from somewhere, and I guess that dignity and freedom and equality were such a good start. And after Second World War, they are doing a great job in kind of discovering with our recta ratio what else should be put in on the kind of on the international charter, symbolized in universal declaration and all the pacts and covenants and conventions and practices. So my question for you would be, I guess you probably wanted to tell us that what different outcomes would your non-consensus standing give in specific human rights issues that we still have in the world? I know that you are dealing with them in your book. You didn't have time to describe. That would be. I'm not sure what high end, what good aim can bring your attack on the foundations of human rights project.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I use the word myth in a pretty standard sense, something that's not true. If you go into literary studies, they use a different meaning of myth, but I'm using it in a standard sense. The consensus concept is a false concept. If evolution is true, human rights are false. What would I put in its place? That's the last chapter of my book. I didn't get into this here. I wasn't planning on getting here. It was just a proposal. But it seems to me that if we're going to deal with moral issues, including problems of justice and international justice, I would like to see us use what I call the totality of our moral being. Human rights taps into arguably part of human nature, a sense of fairness. Franz de Waal argues that not just humans, but capuchin monkeys have an innate sense of what he calls egocentric fairness. Possibly human rights feeds into that, and that's why it would become so powerful. But I would prefer people apply the whole of their moral being. I like the analogy, the Buddhist analogy of the elephant and the blind Indians. Again, not politically correct. I use the word blind. But each one felt part of the elephant and thought they were describing the whole thing. You have to take all those descriptions to get a fuller description of the elephant itself. It seems to me that the different normative moral theories, Kantianism, utilitarianism, etc., they're blind Indians. They capture part of the nature of human morality, but not all of it. I would like to see humans apply sympathy, empathy, a sense of fairness, altruism, and reason to moral issues. So, for example, abortion, is a fetus sentient in the first trimester? I believe the answer is no, and I believe in the third trimester it's yes. It is a moral virtue to waste life? No. and we can apply virtue ethics, different kinds of ethics. And when different normative theories converge on the same answer, a consensus, you have a pretty strong moral theory. I would prefer seeing issues of morality and justice argued from this point of view, applying all of our moral nature, not part of it, to something. And human rights is a very recent phenomenon. Something I'd rather we not appeal to mythic entities for why we should do something or not do something, why the state should or should not, why should we have this international law or not that. Not appeal to mythical entities like the ancients did with their gods, but to realities, sympathy, realities of human morality, human moral nature. There are people, it's a matter of degree. Some people don't have sympathy and empathy, a sense of fairness. They're called psychopaths. Robert Hare woke me up on that topic. They're the morally blind. I'm not going to make an argument to them for why they should be moral. They lack the stuff of morality. The rest of us have the stuff of morality. Let's apply all of it to various topics, not just part of it, like political partisanship. Some is utilitarian, everything's from a utilitarian point of view, another from a Kantian point of view, another from a cultural relativism point of view, and all the rest of it. That's not the clearest answer, but it's the best I can do right now.
Thank you, Professor Boyan Spajc, has a question.
I don't hear. I can't hear. Okay, we're back to technical difficulties.
Unmute, Boyan.
I can hear the previous gentleman in the red shirt, but not the next gentleman.
Unmute, Boyan.
Wait a second.
There you are.
Ah, you can hear me
Yeah.
now. Could be
Okay.
something wrong with my headphones. Yeah, maybe out of battery or something like that. I'll try to continue with this line posed. I'm definitely not in the group with Dejan when it comes to this. So if I understood you well, and of course I read parts of your book and about human rights, and I find it really interesting. And I'm completely down with the idea that if there is if there is you're trying, the way I understand it, to identify the existing ontology behind the standard concept of human rights. And that existing ontology, if we can call it ontology, doesn't hold water. I mean, it's and I think I always somehow agreed with. I'm in agreement with that. So I'm definitely not a representative of the standard concept in the way I think about human rights. My issue here is just the practical consequences of switching positions. So even if we, and I think my argument or my question is in line practically with the thinking you mentioned, Daniel Dennett, for example, his position on his brief position on human rights. So even if it's not ontologically sound to explain human rights the way and understand human rights the way they are explained, Dennett claims, and I think I could agree on that point, that even if it's an untrue idea, a wrong idea, it's still a useful one. So my question is basically similar somehow to Dejan's, in the sense that even if the idea in itself is based on dubious ontology, to say the least, does it make given all the advances, at least the way I see it, and at least the way Dejan also presented it, given all the advancements in the political societies, especially in regards of restricting the state in certain senses, does this ontological switch that you make, does it actually change does it change a lot in terms of consequences of human rights as an idea? Or are they two completely different planes? One being normative in the sense that human rights are successful in, even if they are ontologically placed or ontologically explained wrongly, are they still suitable to do the job that they are supposed to do? And that job is primarily to restrict state power in certain key areas of an individual's life. So that's the question.
Okay, it's a very good question. And my answer is basically, you're referring to, can you hear me? My answer basically is that we have a new version of the noble lie. And I'm the kind of philosopher who is motivated by truth. And so I don't think a noble lie, we can argue about the effects of human rights. And I didn't get into that, whether it produces more good than bad, right? That's a separate question. I'm interested in truth. Is it true? What are we talking about? And given something that we're talking about, is it true? I would prefer, and my last chapter when I give an alternative, what I call a better way, right? That I wrote with individuals in mind, mainly. Me as a human being, how should I deal with matters of morality, moral issues and justice issues and international issues? How should I think and argue? And that's where I go back to the nature of our collective moral sense, not wanting, oh, my battery is getting low. Don't do this. My battery's getting low. Not, I still have 32 minutes. Not in the sense of I'm going to run for politics and there's no way I'm going to be elected locally, nationally, to anything, given this position on human rights. It is radical, but I'm motivated by truth, not the effects. Does the international human rights doctrine and law produce more good than bad? I wouldn't be surprised if somebody argued yes, and I might not find anything wrong with that argument. I just don't like the idea of a noble lie. That's Plato's Republic, which is, as Karl Popper pointed out, it's a recipe for a totalitarian state. And that goes against my grain as a human being and as a philosopher. So I'm not going to use the language of human rights to argue a particular topic. I'm going to use something else, something that we can all relate to: sympathy, empathy, fairness, altruism, reason. We can come to a lot of agreement and settle a lot of disagreements by applying the whole of our moral nature, rather than appealing, well, this goes against human rights. Right? I have a human right to this. People are claiming all sorts of rights as human rights. It's kind of like a mania. I don't want any part of that. I don't know if that answers the question. But do I expect international bodies to reject the human rights myth and take on what I'm talking about? I name it naturalia because you need a name. Not at all. I have no delusions in that regard. This is for individual thinkers, basically.
All right. If there is nobody else that would like to ask a question, I would like to ask a question. First, regarding your claim that human rights, all human rights have to be universal. Some human rights scholars, including James Griffin, that you mentioned, make a difference between basic and derived human rights. So you specifically mentioned the case of women's rights, and you said that they cannot possibly be human rights because not all human beings are women. Do you think that it is sensible to think of human rights in this way, in terms of basic and derived human rights, and perhaps it can provide a sort of solution to the problem that you identified? And
I have no. Sorry.
And the second is related to the problem of marginal cases. What are you familiar? What do you think about the John Rawls' notion of range properties? And do you think it could provide a solution to the problem of marginal cases?
It's been too long since I've read Rawls and the details. I didn't refresh my memory on Rawls. What's in my permanent memory is the veil of ignorance. But his theory of justice is a thought experiment. He's not a bedrock human rights theorist. You won't find a consensus concept in his writings. You find something else. I have no problem with rights talk. I just would prefer clarity, right? If somebody's arguing that somebody's human right has been violated, what do you mean by human right? Do you mean human rights is a social construction? Say it. Don't bait and switch. Make it look like you're talking about the standard, or what I call the consensus concept of human rights, but then slide on to a different concept. I have a serious problem with that. I would prefer being honest and upright. Charles Bates and Donnelly, they're very straightforward. Social constructionism. They reject human nature in Donnelly's case, and Bates that rejects it as a foundation for human rights. I like that, but it has to be recognized they're no longer talking about the consensus concept of human rights. They need to be clear, and others, they need to be clear and say, look, I'm not defending that concept. I recognize it's the dominant concept. It's the consensus concept in the documents. And it is the concept that most people believe in human rights, like JFK and Malcolm X, right? My concept is different, and then defend it. I would love to see that. I would love to see politicians talk like that. I don't think it's going to happen. It's bait and switch. And get elected.
I believe Professor Miodrag Ivanovic would like to ask a question.
Thank you. You basically, by the end of your last response, you somehow almost answered my question. I wanted to ask you about exactly this so-called political conceptions of human rights, like Charles Bates, and there's also a legal philosopher, Joseph Raz. I'm not sure whether you relied on his. He's also rejecting the foundationalist approach, and he follows, and I would say even more elaborately develops this idea of political conception of human rights as a particular type of construction which serves exactly the goal that Boyan mentions, to trump the sovereignty, the argument of sovereignty of states, both internally with respect to its own citizens and externally to other governments, like interfering into internal affairs of. So human rights is in that respect a kind of a trump card, but he rejects the idea of finding any meaningful ground for justifying diachronically universality of human rights or innate nature of human rights. So basically, as I said you probably answered my question. So what you said would be in line with this political conception of human rights.
Yeah, call it a social construction and don't confuse it with the consensus concept. And that to me is very important, clarity and truth. Does it work? Has humanity built an international structure that works? Arguably, yes. But is it true? What is it? Right? That's the ontological question that interests me. And I would love to see more clarity there. And if you're going to defend a particular concept or institution, a human rights institution, how does that relate to the consensus concept? I mean, Weitz was, I thought, pretty clear, but problematic for a number of reasons. So I didn't read the other scholars' work that you named. Sorry.
Okay, if there is nobody else interested in asking a question, I think we can bring to an end our today's session. Of course, on behalf of the Belgrade Legal Theory Group, I would like to thank you all for joining us today and for participating in the debate. And of course, special thanks to Professor Stamos for this wonderful presentation. I believe that our audience has benefited greatly from listening to what you have to say, and I hope we'll see you in the future in one of our next sessions.
And I want to thank you very much for the invitation for everybody who's here and whoever might watch this. It's a radical talk. No question about it. All right, take care and thank you and farewell, especially during a pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you.